Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of the Jeffersonian period from about 1800 through 1820. And in this lecture, we're going to be focusing on Indian relations in Jeffersonian America. I want to begin by showing you this chart that indicates growth in the United States up to the year 1820. And without getting into great detail about what the various colors mean, you can see that clearly the most intense growth was along the eastern seaboard. But by 1820, Americans were beginning to settle further west, out into the regions of the Midwest, even some crossing the Mississippi River. And that kind of settlement is going to leave Americans further and further into conflict with Indians who lived in those regions. So that growth and expansion of the United States is going to be one of the major factors we're going to talk about in leading to confrontation with the Indians. So if we just take a moment to look back a little bit further in our history and think about relations between the colonists, one-time colonists in the United States, and Indians, recall that there was a bit of a pattern early in that period. After the French and Indian War, you recall, the Indians suffered because they had allied themselves with the French, who lost in that war. They had been accustomed to playing off the British against the French, and now they only had the British to work with, and their closest allies, the French, were defeated. You might also recall that Pontiac had led a rebellion against the British soon after that, a rebellion that ultimately failed. So this kind of process carries forward, and it's not a quick process. In fact, it takes several centuries. If we think about the first contact between Europeans and Indians taking place in roughly 1492 or soon after, in the British colonies in 1609, it's not until well after the Civil War, the late 1800s, that the last American Indians will be confined to reservations. So it's a process that takes nearly 300 years. In the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, the process of the United States taking land from the Indians takes several forms, including treaties, purchase, and quote-unquote civilizing the Indians, which we're going to be talking more about. But just to give you some examples of each of these, in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, in the Treaty of Paris, the Indians lost much of their land in the Ohio Territory. And recall once again, they had fought primarily on the side of the British and thus were treated as losers at the end of that war. In terms of purchase, in 1787, Secretary of War Henry Knox helped to create the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which enforced a policy of purchasing land from the Indians. Nonetheless, it was still a process of obtaining Indian lands and passing it along to colonists who are now becoming the early United States. And after the Constitution and the new United States government is installed, while the government continued to make treaties and also take lands through purchase, they began to advocate increasingly the idea of quote-unquote civilizing the Indians. And this was actually Thomas Jefferson's favored policy. He was a big supporter of Americanizing the Indians, trying to turn them into farmers, owning their own land, similar to the white colonists. Jefferson's policy as president, he described as peace, civilization, and land appropriation. Now, in the view of that day, Jefferson viewed this as a rational and respectable way of treating the Indians. What Jefferson and the rest of the nation would eventually learn is that you can't colonize with a conscience. You can't be a friend to a people that you are systematically taking their land. And so, as we're going to be discussing in this lecture, after the War of 1812, American policy gradually shifts in favor of removal and just removing the Indians from their lands east of the Mississippi River and sending them west of the Mississippi River. After the turn of the century into the 1800s, Indians were in deep trouble, even into the interior of the United States, in the Ohio Territory towards the Mississippi River, and even into the interior. The coastal tribes were mostly destroyed or removed by that point, and the conflict was now turning into those interior lands, northern Georgia, the Ohio River Valley, and so on. There were various responses by Native Americans to white encroachment. There were a number of Indian prophets preaching to their followers about various things, but often about nativism. Reject the white ways and return to pure Indian ways. The most notable of these prophets was Tenskwatawa, who is pictured here. Along with his brother Tecumseh, they formed the most important pair of Indian leaders of the era and around the War of 1812. They were Shawnee Indians in western Ohio. Tenskwatawa in this picture was a real hellraiser. He was obnoxious. He was a drinker. Then, at age 30, in 1805, he had a profound emotional experience. He went into a trance, had dreams and visions. He came out of that experience a changed man and went on to become a prophet of his people. Like other Indian prophets, Tenskwatawa preached nativism, a rejection of the white ways. He became opposed to alcohol. He preached a return to traditional food and dress. Then in 1806, his religion, which was spreading quickly, was challenged by the governor of the Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, who later on, of course, would become president. Harrison told the Indians, "If he really is a prophet, ask of him to cause the sun to stand still, or the dead to rise from their graves. If he does these things, you may then believe that he has been sent from God." Well, Tenskwatawa learned from some visiting American astronomers of an upcoming eclipse, and he predicted that the sun would go dark on that day. The Indians were stunned, and Tenskwatawa immediately became the most influential of the Indian prophets. He founded his town, called Prophetstown, near the Tippecanoe River. His influence, and that of his brother as well, his brother Tecumseh, pictured here, went well beyond merely religious influence when they learned of a sale of Indian lands to the U.S. government. He argued that no sale of Indian lands was legitimate unless all tribes agreed. He fought against the sale. He met several times with Harrison and called for Indian unity. You might recall back to Pontiac's Rebellion when we talked about the idea of pan-Indianism, different tribes coming together. That idea is revived here, with Tecumseh as one of the great driving forces, bringing different Indian groups together. The confrontation between Harrison and the prophet intensified. Add to this the confusion of this era before the War of 1812, the British selling arms to Indians on the frontier and supposedly stirring up trouble. The conflict reached a head in August 1811 at the Battle of Tippecanoe. The forces met in battle with about 200 casualties, dead and wounded on both sides. But the battle was devastating to Tenskwatawa. He had claimed that his men would be protected by God in battle and would be invincible. This was not the case, and many of his followers deserted him in the aftermath. Here's a quote from one Indian who was there. "The prophet had promised that every squaw of any note should have one of the white warriors to use as her slave or to treat as she pleased. Oh, how these women were disappointed. Instead of slaves and spoils of the white men coming into town with the rising sun, their town was in flames, and women and children were hunted like wolves and killed by hundreds or driven into the river and swamps to hide. With the smoke of that town and the loss of that battle, I lost all hope of the red man being able to stop the whites. Harrison returned to burn Prophetstown to the ground, and the Battle of Tippecanoe became a great victory for the white man. With so much conflict between themselves and the American colonists, the Indians aligned themselves with the British during the War of 1812. And so once again, they have aligned themselves with the loser in a war, and they were treated as such in the aftermath. But as we have also described, it is after the War of 1812 that the United States moves increasingly towards a policy of removal rather than trying to maintain cordial relations with the Indians, signing treaties, or purchasing their land. We're going to be talking much more about the process of removal a little bit later, but let me just mention some of the reasons for that shift in policy now. Part of it related to racism. There are many layers to this, but there was the belief that Indians were not making effective use of the land. They didn't know how to use the land properly, and so they had no right to stay. We're going to talk more about this idea later. It relates to an idea called manifest destiny and others. There was also the belief that society wouldn't progress and advance if Indians occupied the land instead of whites. With the expansion of cotton in the South, there was an economic push for Americans to obtain more and more land to grow cotton. And even something so coincidental as the discovery of gold on Indian land will lead to desires to further take land from the Indians. We're going to talk about all of those things in future lectures. I would also note very quickly that one of the Americans who spearheaded this drive to remove the land from the Indians was the hero of the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson, who by the end of the period we're discussing today is going to be making a push to become President of the United States.